Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about two news stories that have come up that both kind of have to do with the same thing, and it's basically the idea of production companies, or movie studios. Rushing films when either A, they don't need to, or B, when certain things arise instead of actually trying to make a good film. Now, the two films in question are Star Wars Episode 9 and Dark Phoenix, and there's been two things that have come out today about those films that is very, very concerning. Um, Now, just to go through this, the production process of a film consists of basically three parts. There's pre-production, production, and post production. Now, pre production consists of stuff like writing the script, hiring on a director, actors, scouting locations, things like that. Basically, all the prep work that needs to be done before the film is actually made, and also the allocation of financials. Um, the production itself is the actual filming of the movie, or the principal photography, basically. All of the stuff that goes into that, getting the actors from A to B, filming all the scenes, any of the stunts, all of that stuff. That's really the production. Then the post production consists of all your editing, your or most of your editing, your adding in CGI, any kind of stuff you have to add in post, reshoots, that kind of thing. So the most important part of a production for any film, really, in terms of what I think of, is pre-production, because pre-production is where you lay down all the groundwork. If you fuck up the pre-production, the rest of it is just complete garbage. For the most part, there's really not a lot you can do to save it after that. If you exit pre-production and go into production, and you're flying by the seat of your pants, and half your stuff isn't done, a lot of the times that ends in absolute failure. And I'm going to go through some of the Dark Phoenix stuff first, just because it's kind of shorter, and then I'll go into the Rise of Skywalker, Episode 9, whatever the hell you want to call it, that stuff in a minute. So as far as Dark Phoenix, news came out today that basically it was reported that Dark Phoenix was actually two different films. It was actually going to be a two-part series of films, and apparently late in pre-production, like late, like about to go into production. The studio came in and told Simon Kinberg, who was the writer and director of Dark Phoenix, that it was going to now be one film. So he then had to trim down two, what I would assume to be 120-minute screenplays, into one 120-minute screenplay. Now, I know there were a lot of financial decisions going into that because of the Disney Fox buyout, because of the reboot, because Disney probably mandated certain things. But at the same time, you have to be able to look at it and say, look, if we're going to do this, you should push back the release date, and we have to extend the pre production so that we can actually write a legitimate script instead of just combining these two stories. And that's what you would do if you wanted to make a good movie. Now, we obviously know that Dark Phoenix has hit theaters, and it is not doing very well. It is getting ripped apart by critics, it is getting ripped apart by fans, and nobody seems to like this thing. Um, and that's one of those things. Studios, when they sweep in and they do dumb stuff like that, it kills the movies. It kills the movie that they do it to, and we've seen it in the past with other things. Um, Anything, well, most things that have a really, really troubling, movies that had really, really bad script writing processes, stuff that was really, really terrible. Got people that went, and that kind of bleeds more off into the other news that we got today, which is from Star Wars Episode 9, which, by the way, nobody gives a shit about. But it is kind of interesting to see Disney still putting their foot in their mouth, because the Star Wars films in general, after Force Awakens, have essentially been production nightmares. You had Rogue One, which had extensive, extensive reshoots, from what we understand, even though the product that came out was relatively good. Then you had had Last Jedi, which speaks for itself. You had Solo, which essentially had to refilm about 80 to 90% of its actual of its. It had to refilm 80 to 90% of the film, and they fired the two directors that they hired. And now Episode 9 again has a lot of trouble because they fired Colin Trevorrow. They had J.J. Abrams come on at the last minute. They rewrote the script on the fly. They started production without a completed script, and now we have news that the actual editor is editing the film on site during filming. Or the editor did. He was started editing the film on site, which is insane. Usually, what'll happen is they'll do dailies, which is basically just whatever they film that day, and they will send it over to the editor, and the editor will kind of put together a rough cut of the film after they have enough dailies, and then after that they'll show the rough cut, and then they'll kind of trim out what they don't like, and then they'll polish it up, and you get your finished product eventually. But what appears to be happening here is because the production was so compact, because they actually state that the production for episode 9 is 4 months shorter than the production time for Force Awakens. Now, that is a third of a year that they just cut off and said you have to do it in this amount of time. That is an insane crunch to put people under. Now look, I don't think this movie is going to be good. I didn't think this movie was going to be good from its inception because of everything that came before it. But this just doesn't add to it. This is a movie that it feels like a Lucasfilm and Disney are just forcing out. It's like pushing a cow into. It's like pushing a baby cow out and directly into a meat grinder. That's what this film feels like at this point. It's like they know it's going to fail. They don't care. They're obligated to make it. They're just going to dump the minimum amount of money into it. They're probably not even going to do all that much advertising for it, and then it's going to come out and no one's going to give a shit. Again, this movie comes out in 6 months. It comes out in Christmas of this year. I don't remember the exact date. I think it's December 18th. But but just to see that this production, again, it's kind of, I don't even know if it's the transparency or if this stuff is just leaking out because there's so much crap going on. But when you see movies like this, you just wonder, what are you doing from a studio standpoint to do this stuff? There's such disorganization. None of it makes sense. Like, I know, from hearing from people that have been on film sets, it's kind of controlled chaos, and I get that, but there has to be some form of order at a higher level in order for that film to be made and to be made well. And if a studio is incapable of making a film in an orderly fashion and giving the people that are involved in the film ample time to do stuff, especially if the studio is coming down and asking them to make changes at the last minute or rushing them through a production or trying to rush them through a production, then or I shouldn't say trying to rush them through a production because that's what they're doing. But if they come down and they say we want changes to this now, they have to be told that, or they have to allow the people that are making the film enough time to make those changes in an orderly fashion so that the resulting product is not a piece of trash. And again, this is something that we're seeing more and more of with these bigger budgeted films, where the studios just want to push them out as fast as possible. Again, I kind of attribute a little bit of this to Marvel because of their production schedules, but the difference is that Marvel is very organized, is very methodical with what they produce and how they're going about it. They have this stuff planned years down the road, and they have everything lined up. They don't make changes at the last minute for the most part, and a lot of the movies that they do don't have incredibly extensive reshoots. So they have all the puzzle pieces in place essentially before that the next movie is even made, which is how ideally you would like to make a serialized franchise. But what everybody else seems to be doing is they're just saying, oh, we're going to make 3 movies, and then they make the first one, and then they just say, okay, just make the next two, and do whatever you want. Or something like that, or the studio comes down and says, "Okay, this was going to be 2 movies, but now we're going to make it into one." It's something that's insane. You can look at some other stuff too that people have criticized, even though the productions for it were even though the productions were, I think, somewhat smooth. The Hobbit movies that really should have been maybe 2 movies, probably just one if you had trimmed a lot of the fat out of it. Probably maybe like 1 3 hour movie or 3.5 hour movie instead of, three 2 hour movies. But for whatever reason, they decided to stretch it, and they did the opposite. They tried to stretch it so that they could make money off of the movies, like they did with the Lord of the Rings, and they wound up putting a bunch of extenuous stuff in there that should have been cut out. A lot of the stuff from the Hobbit novel that really probably should have been cut out. There's stuff I think in the first one about like a necromancer that ultimately leads nowhere. But there's a lot of stuff like that that's going on in production companies these days, and it's disheartening to see people at the top of these studios that don't know how to make movies. It's insane. You can't come down to a movie that is about to exit pre-production and say you need to rewrite your script. That is insane. That is legitimately insane because you're not going to wind up with a good product no matter who you have directing that movie. It would be a miracle if you wound up with a good product. At the same time, you can't go down and say, I want a triple A big budget movie and I want it in 6 months. Because that's essentially what Rise of Skywalker is at this point because of the troubled production cycle that it was. It's what, about 6 to 8 months, I think, is the production for it, or something like that, for the actual from pre-production to filming, because there really wasn't any pre-production. Most of the pre-production was done on the fly, which is again is insane. You can't do that with a big budget film like that. You're investing $250 million. Now I'm aware Disney, that's probably chump change considering they just paid I think it was what, $73 billion for Fox in the buyout, but it's still a ridiculous amount of money to invest in something and then just try to rush it through. It's like you bought a Ferrari and you decided that you wanted to drive it off the lot that minute instead of filling out any of the paperwork, and the thing still has, it still has crappy tires on it that the dealers put, and there's dust and everything on it. It hasn't been washed or something like that. It's the equivalency of buying a sports car and and or buying a I don't even know what to compare it to at this point. It's terrible. And again, I didn't think Dark Phoenix was necessarily going to be a good movie. I was hoping that it would be at least something that was watchable, and I definitely was not expecting Rise of Skywalker to be a good movie at all. But again, I was expecting it to be at least a watchable film, unlike The Last Jedi. But all of this production stuff with and again, I'm using these two films as examples because that's the news that I saw today, but there's a lot of other films that have had this problem, and there's probably a lot of other films that are going to have this problem in the future if things keep up the way they are. So I'd like to know your thoughts on the situation. Were you excited for either of these two films before they came out? What do you think about studio meddling? Can it help a film in some cases? Is it mostly detrimental? Put your thoughts in the comments. I like to know what you think about things. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?